The timber walkway groaned beneath my polished Oxfords, each step releasing a thick, wet twent squelchy that echoed unnaturally in the stagnant air. It wasn't just damp, it was Suvri remembering the Valley of the Kings, tomb, seep, the polished surface, slick with centuries of forgotten moisture. My footsteps were the only sound besides the distant rhythmic drip, drip, drip debris from a broken fountain somewhere in the overgrown labyrinth. I focused on the debt, $2.3 million. The number was a cold coin in my pocket, a physical weight against my thigh. I ignored the oppressive silence. The way the skeletal Ferris wheel, rusted into a jagged constellation against the watery moon, seemed to lean closer. Vines, thick as pythons, choked the once bright painted facade of the pyramid. Shaped ticket booth, their leaves glistening with a damp sheen that reflected the weak moonlight in oily streaks. I passed a section where the timber had rotted into a jagged, blackened mess, the forger turning into a deeper sucking fungloop as my foot sank slightly. The air smelled of wet stone, decaying wood, and something faintly metallic like old blood. My fingers brushed the golden coin in my pocket, 2D, a relic from a desperate gamble last week, now vanished. I checked twice. The absence was a fresh bruise. I kept walking the polished walkway, resistance a dull ache in my soles, each step a tiny victory against the sinking feeling. The moonlight cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to drip like water down the crumbling sphinx statues, their stone eyes hollow and watchful. I heard nothing but my own breath, shallow and controlled, and the insistent drip, drip, drip. Then, cutting through the silence like a shard of glass, came the laughter, a child's laugh. Clear, bright, impossibly young, bouncing off the rusted metal frame of the Ferris wheel and seeming to come from the empty swing set further ahead. It wasn't a memory, it was wind here vibrating in the damp air, making the hairs on my neck prickle. I froze. The laughter wasn't coming from the park, it was coming from Fundinseed, the silence, a violation of the empty space. My hand instinctively went to my pocket, but the coin was gone. Only the cold, smooth metal of the coin's absence remained. The laughter cut off abruptly, as if a switch had been thrown. The sudden silence was heavier than before, thick enough to choke on. The only sound was the relentless twin drip, drip, dripping from the fountain and the frantic hammering of my own heart against my ribs. Then, the sound I'd been waiting for, the one that made the air thicken further, a single, precise drip of water, falling from a high, dark branch onto the cold, rusted chain of the empty swing. It hit with a sound like a tiny, perfect stone dropped into a still pond, plink, plink. The water droplet hung for a fraction of a second on the chain, reflecting the watery moonlight like a tiny, cold star, before vanishing into the darkness below. The swing chain didn't creak. It didn't sway. It just held the drop, and then the silence returned, deeper and more absolute than before, holding its breath. The park itself was listening. The laughter ceased, leaving a vacuum that pressed against my eardrums. A calculation. The odds of a child's laughter, originating from an abandoned amusement park, particularly one steeped in this level of decay, were negligible. Yet, the sound had been undeniably funny there. I registered the anomaly, filed it under unexplained phenomena, and proceeded. The debt remained, a constant pressure against my ribs, $2.3 million. A sum that demanded action, not speculation. Then, I saw it. A distortion in the shadows clinging to the base of the pyramid-shaped structure. Not a trick of the moonlight, but a tangible shift, a severance. A darkness detaching itself from the stone, coalescing into a form. It resolved itself into the vague shape of a cat, all blackness and absence, the moonlight passing footy through it as if it were smoke. It moved with an unsettling fluidity, a silent glide over the moss, choked ground. I followed. Not with eagerness, but with a clinical detachment. The laughter was a data point. This thing was another. My Oxfords crunched on the gravel path, a faint, dry fung crunchy that felt amplified in the stillness. Each step was measured, deliberate. The cat's form wavered, the edges blurring as it moved, reforming with each stride. It was less a solid creature and more a negative space, a void momentarily given shape. The carousel loomed ahead, its painted horses skeletal under the watery moonlight. Hieroglyphs, unfamiliar and unsettling, were crudely painted over the once bright facades, twisting familiar figures into grotesque parodies. A jackal, a falcon, a figure with the head of a scarab beetle fui, all rendered in a style that felt both ancient and wrong. The cat paused, its form momentarily solidifying against the backdrop of the decaying carousel. It didn't, he turned, it acknowledged my presence. It simply fine moved ID I continued to follow, my focus narrowing. The scent of wet stone and decaying wood had faded, replaced by a faint metallic tang, like the residue of old machinery. I registered the shift, a minor alteration in the sensory landscape, but dismissed it as irrelevant. The debt was the primary concern, the anomalies were secondary. The collapsed ticket booth was a jumble of splintered wood and rusted metal. Vines had swallowed it whole, their tendrils snaking across the crumbling facade. The cat disappeared into the shadows within, then reappeared leading me onward. I felt the familiar weight in my pocket, the golden coin. A surge of something akin to relief. Number, it was a purely physiological response, a confirmation that at least twentieth variable remained consistent. I reached into my pocket, the fabric cool against my fingertips. The coin was there, solid, real, a tangible asset in a landscape of decay and uncertainty. I registered the sensation, the precise pressure against my palm, the cool smoothness of the metal. A small, almost imperceptible sun-click echoed in the silence as I brought my hand back out. The pocket was empty. The coin was gone, no sound, no rustle of fabric, no indication of its departure. Just the cold, smooth emptiness of the pocket, a void mirroring the unsettling absence of the cat. The crunchy of my footsteps on the gravel seemed to mock the silence that followed. The debt remained, $2.3 million. The booth's collapse was a mouth-breathing rot, splintered tongue of wood, rusted wire teeth gnashing against the silence. My fingers clawed through the damp detritus, each movement a footshred, a wet imprint left behind on the timber surface. The air should have reeked mildew, iron, the thick musk of centuries. But there was nothing, no scent, no weight to the atmosphere. Just the hollow press of my own breath, the hissy of it escaping like a punctured lung. I crouched, knees sinking into something soft, moss perhaps, or the decayed remains of a ticket stub. The coin had to be here. It tended to be. My palm slid over the slick surface of a rusted lever, the metal cold as a corpse wrist. The damp sea squelchet of my fingers dragging through the grime filled my ears, the only sound in the scentless void. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a metronome of panic. The debt was still there, a weight I could T-shake, but now it was joined by something else, something sharper, a compulsion to foint Stephen died, to foimap every inch of this ruin until the coin reappeared, until the world made sense again. I pressed my open hand against the stone wall behind the booth, the surface slick with moisture. No texture, no smell, just the damp squelchet of my fingers dragging along the cold. The absence was worse than the presence of rot. At least rot had a scent, a history. This was just empty then. The voice, not a whisper, not a breath. A precise detached recitation, numbers peeling back from infinity, *5432, 1 asterisk. The sound slithered through the silence, each digit a blade dragging against bone. My fingers froze against the stone. The voice was inside my skull, or perhaps outside. It didn't matter. The countdown coiled around my thoughts, a serpent of compulsion. I didn't move, couldn't he? The squelchet of my movements had stopped. The world had narrowed to the voice, the numbers, the hollow echo of the booth. Collapse. *0. The digit hung in the air, a finality. Then, nothing. Only the drip, drip of water, slow and deliberate. Pooling somewhere in the dark. The compulsion didn't fade. If anything, it sharpened. A needle driven deeper. I had to find the coin. Had to. I rose, my boots leaving damp prints on the wood. The booth's remnants loomed around me, a maze of rust and rot. My fingers trembled as I reached for another section of debris, the focolche, of my touch the only sound. The scentless void pressed in, suffocating. The voice was gone, but the countdown lingered, a ghost in the silence. I didn't hear the footsteps, didn't smell them, but the fortune of wet fabric against wood was unmistakable. And then, the click of a rusted hinge. The click of the hinge was a punctuation mark, a period ending one sentence and beginning another. The air thickened, a viscous pressure against my skin. The voice squelchet of my boots on the rotting timber faded, swallowed by a new texture beneath my sole's twin smooth, cold stone. I moved forward, compelled, the memory of the voice tendy, the numbers sended a phantom ache behind my eyes. The hall opened before me, a cavern of fractured light mirrors. Hundreds of them, lining the walls, the ceiling even jutting out at impossible angles from the floor. Each pane was cracked, spiderwebbed with fissures that distorted the reflections within. The moonlight filtering through the decaying roof fractured into 1,000 shimmering shards, painting the space in a sickly pale light. The scrape of my boot against the stone was amplified, echoing back at me from a dozen different angles, each a distorted version of my own movement. I stopped, a tremor running through me. The reflections weren't right. They weren't mirroring me, not accurately. One showed me hunched over, older, my face etched with a despair I hadn't yet earned. Another presented a figure standing behind me, a blurred, indistinct shape that seemed to writhe within the glass. The compulsion tightened its grip, urging me forward, deeper into the labyrinth of reflections. The scentlessness was a constant, oppressive weight. It amplified the sounds, made them more tangible, more threatening. Each scrapers of my boot resonated with an unnatural clarity, bouncing off the mirrored surfaces, creating a disorienting symphony of echoes. I focused on the mechanics of my movements, dying the lift of my foot, the shift of my weight, the pressure of my hand against the cold stone wall. Anything to anchor myself to the present, to resist the swirling chaos of the reflections. One mirror showed the swing set, the one from the other side of the park. It was clearer than the others, the details sharp and unsettling. And on the swing, a shadow. Not a reflection of a person, but a dark, amorphous shape that seemed to absorb the light around it. It didn't move, didn't breathe, but its presence felt deliberate. A prickle of something cold and unfamiliar crawled across my skin. The scrape of my boots seemed to falter, the sound momentarily lost in the suffocating stillness. Then the bleeding began. A hand, rusted wire, twisted and gnarled, reaching out from the mirror's surface. It didn't break the glass, didn't shatter the reflection. It simply extended. It reached towards my reflection, fingers twitching as if grasping for something just beyond its reach. I froze, every muscle locked in place. The hand retreated, disappearing back into the mirror's depths, leaving behind a faint residue of metallic scent 20 phantom, smell that vanished as quickly as it appeared. The scrape of my boot against the stone became a frantic rhythm, a desperate attempt to escape the encroaching madness. Another reflection, a corridor identical to the one I was in, but subtly different. The mirrors were cleaner, the light brighter. And at the end of the corridor, a figure stood silhouetted against the light. It was tall, gaunt, and seemed to be composed of something else, something not quite human. The scrape of my boot seemed to amplify, echoing from the corridor in the mirror, as if I were being pursued. The reflections were no longer just images. They were intrusions. The air grew thick, heavy, the sound of my own breath a rasping intrusion. The scrape of my boot against the stone felt like a violation, each step echoing the growing sense of dread. I had to move. Had to escape this hole of shifting lies. Then I saw it. A reflection stepping out of the glass. Not a distorted image, not a phantom projection, but a solid, tangible form. A construct of bone and rusted wire, its joints rattling with each movement. The scrape of its metallic limbs against the stone was a discordant symphony, a prelude to something terrible. I turned, the compulsion momentarily forgotten. The scrape afforded a frantic counterpoint to the approaching horror. It stood behind me. The vines lashed out, a green curtain of decay. Cracked, snap. Each strand thick as my wrist, coated in a slick, viscous film that clung to my skin. I pushed forward, the compulsion a relentless current pulling me deeper into the park's suffocating heart. The sound of the breaking vines was a constant, a wet, percussive rhythm against the silence that had become my world. The Ferris wheel, once a beacon of childish joy, was now a skeletal cage consumed by the relentless green. It groaned under the weight of the vines, a mournful sigh lost in the rustling foliage. The overgrowth was accelerating. It wasn't the slow, patient creep of nature reclaiming what was lost. This was something else. A hunger. A deliberate, aggressive swallowing of the park's remains. I registered the mechanics of the movement 20, the strain in my shoulders, the pressure of the vines against my arms, the grit of pulverized stone beneath my boots. But the emotional weight felt muted. A clinical observation rather than a visceral response. The shadow cat materialized ahead, a flicker in the periphery, then solidifying just enough to guide my path. It didn't acknowledge me, didn't even seem to see me. It simply moved, a silent, obsidian arrow pointing towards the center of the park. My breath hitched, a small, involuntary sound swallowed by the foosnap by the vines. I focused on the texture of the leaves brushing against my face and the The dampness, the slight prickle of unseen thorns. Anything to maintain a tenuous grip on reality. The vines parted, revealing a clearing. It was circular, perfectly symmetrical, and utterly incongruous with the surrounding chaos. The ground was packed earth, covered in a thick carpet of moss, and etched into the moss, into the very stone beneath, were symbols, hieroglyphs. Ancient Egyptian. They were unfamiliar, yet resonated with a disturbing familiarity, triggering a phantom ache behind my eyes. The snap of the vines ceased abruptly, leaving a vacuum of silence that felt more oppressive than any noise. The cat paused at the edge of the clearing, its form flickering, momentarily solidifying. I saw it then. The underlying structure fendy a framework of bone, bleached white and intricately interwoven with rusted wire. It was a glimpse, fleeting and horrifying, before the shadow reformed, obscuring the skeletal architecture. The cat's eyes, 2 points of burning ember, fixed on me. A silent assessment, a predator evaluating its prey. The park wasn't abandoned. It was what being abandoned, consumed. The civilization it once represented was being devoured by something. The hieroglyphs seemed to writhe beneath my gaze, the lines shifting, rearranging themselves into patterns that defied comprehension. I felt a tremor in my hands, a subtle vibration that resonated with the symbols, with the overgrowth, with the very ground beneath my feet. The snap of a vine somewhere nearby seemed to echo the tremor, amplifying the sensation. I attempted to recall a scent, any scent. The damp earth, the decaying wood, the metallic tang of the construct. But there was nothing. The loss of smell, a consequence of the Hall of Mirrors, had become a constant, isolating factor. It amplified the other senses, yes, but it also stripped away a vital layer of connection to the world. I relied on the snap of the vines, the scrape of my boots, the distorted echoes of my own breath. The cat's shadow stretched across the moss, elongated and distorted, until it formed a single perfect paw print. It was an imprint of darkness, a void etched into the vibrant green. The lines of the print were sharp, defined, impossibly precise. It lingered for a moment, a silent declaration, then vanished. And in its wake there was only the sound of a single, deep breath a breath that seemed to emanate not from the cat, but from the overgrowth itself, from the park, from the very earth beneath my feet. The tremor intensified, a low thrumming in my bones that resonated with the hieroglyphs. They pulsed now, a sickly green luminescence bleeding from the etched lines. The cat remained motionless, a sentinel of dread. Its ember eyes held no warmth, only a cold, calculating assessment. I registered the mechanics of my breathing, the shallow inhale, the measured exhale, sufu, a futile attempt to anchor myself to something tangible. The loss of smell, a constant absence, amplified the other senses, making the visual distortions almost unbearable. The hieroglyphs seemed to writhe, to breathe. The cat shifted, a fluid movement that defied its skeletal understructure. It lowered its head, a subtle inclination that felt like a command. I followed its gaze to a cluster of objects nestled within the mossed and fudden relics. Not grand monuments, but small, unassuming items. A clay tablet, a tarnished bronze amulet, a fragment of painted pottery. They seemed ordinary, almost pathetic against the backdrop of the encroaching vines. I noted the texture of the moss beneath my boots, the dampness seeping through the thin leather of my shoes. A clinical observation detached from any sense of discomfort. Then they began to hum, a low, resonant vibration that built steadily, filling the clearing with a palpable tension. The sound wasn't audible in the conventional sense. It was felt a pressure against my eardrums, a tremor in my teeth. The relics seemed to glow, their surfaces radiating a faint, sickly light. And then the whispers began, not words, not initially. Just a susurrus, a rustling of voices carried on the wind. I registered the mechanics of the sound, the way it bounced off the vines, the way it seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere at once. The whispers coalesced, forming fragmented phrases. Stories, tales of cities swallowed by the Nile's relentless floods, palaces reclaimed by the desert's insatiable hunger. The narratives were disjointed, chaotic, yet they resonated with a horrifying familiarity. I recognized the cadence, the rhythm of ancient Egyptian, though I couldn't understand the words. The thud of a falling leaf punctuated the whispers, a sharp counterpoint to the mournful drone. The cat's purpose became sickeningly clear. It wasn't guiding me. It was Sufan showing. Me, demonstrating the inevitable fate of all civilizations. The relentless cycle of rise and fall, of creation and destruction. My own civilization, my own life, reduced to a footnote in the grand, indifferent sweep of history. The coin. The loss of the coin. It wasn't a random occurrence, it was a prelude, a severance. The first tendril of the inevitable consumption. I catalogued the sensation of panic rising in my chest, a mechanical process rather than an emotional response. One by one, the relics began to fall, not with a crash, but with a slow, deliberate descent. Each the deed against the stone resonated with a mournful echo. Debt is the root, a voice whispered, seemingly from the relics themselves. Despair is the soil. The words were fragmented, distorted, yet the meaning was undeniable. My debt. The weight of my past actions, the consequences I had so diligently avoided. They were not abstract concepts. They were tangible forces, actively shaping my present, dictating my future. The fufiti of another relic striking the stone seemed to amplify the tremor in my hands. The whispers intensified, converging into a single, overwhelming chorus. The hieroglyphs pulsed with an almost blinding intensity. The air thickened, becoming heavy, suffocating. The cat's ember eyes burned into me, reflecting the sickly green glow of the relics. The thudid of a falling tablet was followed by a whispering futai directly in my ear, a breath of ancient dust and forgotten sorrows. And then, a voice. Not a whisper, but a clear, distinct articulation, distorted and unsettling. It spoke my name backwards. Einapun. Einapun. The park's edge was never an edge, it was a wound, a jagged tear in the fabric of time where the asphalt gave way to a slow, creeping rot. The moonlight, thin as a blade, cut through the skeletal remains of the Ferris wheel, its rusted teeth gnashing at the sky. I stood at the threshold, boots sinking into the damp earth, the scent of damp wood, and something older, something fundrong freen wrong clinging to my throat. My fingers twitched toward my pocket, but the coin was gone, vanished, like a debt paid in blood. Then came the clack-clack, not a sound, but a vibration, a skeletal drumbeat that rattled up through my ribs before I even saw it. My pulse stuttered, a traitorous thing as the construct emerged from the overgrowth, not walking, not moving, but fully unfolding. A grotesque origami of bone and wire. The rusted tendrils of its spine scraped against the vines, each contact a wet winschlick of metal dragging through decay. Its skull, a hollow cage of yellowed bone, tilted toward me, empty sockets reflecting the moon's sickly glow. No eyes, no mouth, just the clack-clack, the rhythmic grinding of its joints, a sound that wasn't made to be heard but to fighty feel, to burrow into the marrow. I turned to run. The vines lashed out before I took a step, a wet, ciphered whip snap, and the first tendril coiled around my ankle, cool and slick as a snake's tongue. I yanked, but the second wrapped around my calf, tightening with a slow, deliberate pressure. The clack-clack-clack grew louder, a metronome of doom, syncing with the frantic thud of my heart. My breath came in shallow gasps, each inhale thick with the scent of damp earth, and something metallic, something metallic. The construct advanced, its rusted wire limbs bending at unnatural angles, each step a deliberate scrape of bone against the undergrowth. I forced myself to move. The vines resisted. My legs burned as the tendrils cinched higher, the foot snap of their movement echoing in my skull. The construct was close now, its hollow skull looming over me, the clack-clack a relentless pulse in my ears. My fingers clawed at the vines, but they only tightened, the pressure a living thing breathing, hungry. The moon cast long, jagged shadows across the ground, and for a moment I saw it, not the construct, but Tanbi reflected in its hollow gaze. A man frozen in time, a debt unpaid, a civilization buried beneath the creeping green. The clack-clack-clack synced with my heartbeat. A single, unbroken fortetan. The air in this place doesn't move. It thickens, clings, each breath a slow drag through wet wool. The clack-clack-clack of the construct's joints has become a second heartbeat, a metronome of rust and bone counting down to something inevitable. I press my palms against the peeling wallpaper, the texture a sickly green, the pattern of vines and lotus flowers warping under my fingers as if the wall itself is breathing. My reflection in the mirror across from me doesn't match. It's a stretched, watery version of myself, mouth open in a silent scream, fingers clawing at the glass. The glass doesn't break, it swallows. The sound, the laughter of children echoes again, iggling, high-pitched, wrong, but this time it's not from the swing set. It's from the mirror. My reflection tilts its head, and for a split second, the shadow behind me moves on its own. A dark shape that doesn't cast light, but totally absorbs then. It's the cat. It's always there, a shifting mass of ink and absence, its presence a weight pressing against my skin. I reach up, nothing. The air is cold where it lingers, the scent of damp earth and something older, something twin-buried, filling my lungs. My nose is gone. No smell. Just the 40 clack-clack, the laughter, the numbers backward in my skull. 7, 6, 5, 40 constructs, hollow gaze, locks onto my reflection. The glass fogs, then clears, and suddenly it's not my face in the mirror anymore. It's the construct's skull, yellowed and grinning, the rusted wire of its spine coiling through the reflection like a serpent. The 40 clack-clack sharpens, a staccato beat against the silence. My breath hitches. The cat's shadow detaches from the wall, slithering across the floor like oil, reforming into the shape of a panther. But its eyes are hollow, its mouth a jagged split in the dark. It doesn't meow. It twinklicks, bone on bone. The reflection of the cat steps onto my shoulder. I don't feel it, but the mirror shows it now, the shadow forming the construct's outline, its spine a lattice of wire and rust, its hollow skull tilting toward the ceiling as if listening. The clack-clack stops. The laughter stops. The numbers stop. Only the first click. A single, precise impact like a bone snapping in half. The mirror darkens. The reflection winks out, and for the first time since this began, I hear my own voice, a whisper from the glass. You were never here. The reflections have multiplied, not just in the shattered remnants of the mirror, but in every polished surface. The brass fittings on the carousel, the rain-slicked metal of the Ferris wheel, even the damp sheen on the overgrown foliage. Each one a distorted echo, a silent scream rendered in the park's peculiar acoustics. The wet Wideti Gaspy escapes them all, a synchronized intake of breath that vibrates through the air, a chorus of agony I cannot voice, my debt, my loneliness. My fear of the relentless green consuming everything. They manifest as fractured images, twisted caricatures of myself, clawing at the glass, mouths open in voiceless terror. The construct is weaving. Not building, but timbit-weaving tendrils of ivy and thorny vines snaking from its rusted joints, binding me to the spot. The footy rustle of leaves is a constant, oppressive presence, a whispering mockery of the wind. It's not the wind, of course, it's the plants. They're purposeful. Each vine curls with an unnerving precision, a calculated pressure against my skin. The cat's shadows dance within the green, shifting, reforming into grotesque parodies of feline grace. Each one a different facet of my despair, feeding on the silent screams. The click of its joints is a punctuation mark to the symphony of suffering. I try to move, but the vines hold fast. They're not constricting, not exactly. More like guiding, directing my gaze to the reflections, to the mirrored suffering. One shows me a lavish apartment, empty and cold. Another, a crowded party, my face a mask of polite indifference. A third, a ledger, numbers blurring into an abyss of debt. Each Benkarsby from the reflections intensifies, a wave of phantom pain washing over me. The air thickens, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something sickly sweet like decaying lilies. My hand brushes against a vine. It's not rough, not thorny. It's smooth, almost silken, but with an underlying rigidity that resists my touch. The photo rustle grows louder, a chorus of whispers echoing the silent screams. I close my eyes, attempting to block out the images, the sounds, the 40 feeling of being watched by 1,000 agonized eyes. But the suffering isn't visual. It's vibrational. It resonates within my bones, a low hum of despair that threatens to shatter my sanity. The construct's head tilts, its rusted wire spine creaking in protest. It's not looking at me, it's looking at the reflections. It seems to be assessing, calculating. The foinklick of its joints is a measured response, a confirmation of some unseen equation. I feel a coldness spreading through my limbs, a numbness that seeps into my very core. The foingaspe from the reflections reaches a crescendo, a unified expression of silent agony. One reflection shows a hand reaching out, a skeletal finger tracing the outline of my face. Another, a mouth opening, a silent scream expanding into a vortex of despair. The fund rustle of the vines intensifies, a wave of green engulfing me. I try to scream, but no sound escapes. Only the foodie gaspide, only the foodie rustle, only the foodie click. The construct extends a rusted hand, its fingers intertwining with the vines. The shadows of the cats coalesce, merging into a single, amorphous mass. The reflections blur, the screams intensify, the suffering becomes unbearable. The cat's shadow dissolves into the construct. The foy rustle of leaves coalesces, sharpening into a single, clear foin-snapped. The vines don't constrict, they shuttle. Like fine silk woven through my bones, cool and unyielding against my skin. Each tendril finds a pulse point, a joint, a hollow beneath my collarbone, pressing with the weight of the park's slow green breath. The 40th rustle of leaves is gone now, replaced by the single perfect rhythm of the drip. 40th drip, 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 on the polished timber of the carousel's base, where rainwater pools in a dent. I count them against my slowing heartbeat. Footed, food, food. Each drop matches a fading beat, a countdown measured in the cold seep of the timber beneath me. The air tastes of wet stone and the sickly sweetness of forgotten lilies, but I don't smell it. I haven't smelled anything since chapter 3. Only the sound. Only the drip, drip, drip sinking with a hollow drumming in my chest. Thud, thud, thud. Slower, slower, the cat's shadow is gone from the green. It's detached now, hovering at the edge of the overgrown path like smoke. It doesn't move. It just T20, a deeper absence feeding on the final wave of my despair. The reflections are gone too. The shattered glass, the brass fittings, the rain-slicked Ferris wheel, all silent now. Only the drip, only the thud. Only the pressure of the vines not binding but tuvy encasing. They're not growing fruity around me, they're growing fruity into me, weaving through the fabric of my clothes, the skin of my neck, until the line between my body and the living shroud dissolves. My fingers twitch against the timber. The wood is smooth, unnaturally cold. The water pooling beneath the drip, a perfect dark mirror reflecting nothing but the slow, green dark above. I watch the water swell, a single bead forming at the edge of the dent. Drip, one heartbeat on drip. Dubbing, another the bead trembles. It's the only thing left moving. The park's sigh, its laughter, its rusted groan, all silenced. Only the dripper city and the thuvud. I try to remember the weight of my gold coin, the one that vanished from my pocket. I try to remember the sound of the child's laughter on the empty swing, but the memory is a dry leaf, brittle and useless. All that remains is the drip, the fufud, fufufeth, the cool silk of the vines against my throat. The heartbeat in my chest is a fading echo. Futhufi. The next drop is delayed. The bead hangs, trembling, a single point of liquid light in the damp gloom. Thud. Thud. My own pulse is a ghost. Thu-thud. Thu. The bead falls. Thufi. Drip. Thi. Sound is different this time. Not a drip. A thutu. A single, precise impact on the polished timber, sharp as a hammer on bone. It resonates up through the wood, through the vines, through my own failing frame. The futhadid isn't just sound. It's the final beat. The last echo, the last echo, the last twinvid of my heart against the timber, and then silence. Not the absence of the drip, but the silences of the drip itself. The timber is dry. The pool is gone. The bead is no longer falling. The drip beat has stopped. The only sound left is the futhad in the hollow where my heart was, and then, as the silence deepens, the echo. A single perfect resonant drip. The last drop falling into the still water beneath it, echoing into the eternal silence of the park. The vines tighten not to hold, but to complete. The timber is dry, the reflection is gone, the drip echoes, and I am gone.